When you think of ancient Sparta, what comes to mind? You probably picture this perfect military state, right? A whole society of elite warriors, all living this life of intense discipline, totally dedicated to defending their home. And at the very heart of that image is this powerful idea, the homoioi, or the equals. But here's the thing, how equal were they really? So, let's dive in and pull apart one of history's most compelling myths. And this right here gets to the absolute core of the Spartan ideal. You see, a full citizen, a Spartiate, wasn't defined by what he did for a living, but by what he didn't do. He wasn't a potter, he wasn't a blacksmith, he wasn't a farmer. No, he was totally freed from all that economic stuff, all supported by the labor of the enslaved Helot population, so that he could pour every single moment into one thing and one thing only, being a soldier. That was their whole identity.
So, that brings us right back to our main question. If all these guys shared this unique lifestyle, completely free from the need to work, did that actually make them all equal? Or was this famous label just hiding a much more complicated and honestly a far harsher reality? Well, that's exactly what we're here to figure out.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the ideal of the equals, and then we'll look at the seriously steep price of citizenship. We'll explore what happened to the folks who fell from the ranks, how all this led to a shrinking elite, and finally, why this Spartan mirage has had such a powerful grip on us for so long.
Okay, so let's kick things off with that foundational concept. Just who were these so-called equals, the homoioi?
So the term itself, homoioios, is really the key. Think of it less as a literal description and more as an ideological statement. It was all about a shared identity, a collective commitment to the state, a totally uniform way of life. But, and this is the critical part, it did not mean everyone had the same amount of money or land. Not even close. And this tension, this gap between the ideal of equality and the reality of inequality is the real heart of the Spartan paradox.
But getting the status of an equal was far from a simple birthright. It was something you had to prove and reprove your entire life by clearing a series of incredibly difficult hurdles.
First, you needed to have 2 Spartan parents. Check. Second, you had to survive the agoge, that infamous, brutal state training program that started when you were just 7. Then, you had to get unanimously elected into a session, basically a communal dining club. And finally, you always had to prove your worth in battle and never, ever show a hint of cowardice. You fail any one of these at any point in your life, and you are out. Done.
And here's where that shiny ideal starts to fall apart. The philosopher Aristotle, who was a pretty sharp critic of Sparta, points out this massive flaw in the system. Remember that third hurdle, joining a dining club? Well, it wasn't free. Every single member had to chip in food and wine from their own land every month. And as Aristotle points out, if you were too poor to pay that tax, you just couldn't belong. Suddenly, the club of equals starts to look pretty exclusive, doesn't it?
So what happened to the guys who couldn't pay, or the ones who failed one of the other tests? Well, they didn't just become regular folks. They were shoved into these new, disgraced social classes, becoming a constant, walking reminder of failure.
There were basically 2 main paths to losing your citizenship. You had the hypomunies, the inferiors, who lost their status because of poverty. They just couldn't afford their mess hall dues anymore. And then you had the tresantes, the tremblers, who lost everything for the ultimate sin in Spartan society, cowardice in battle. So one was a failure of your wallet, the other a failure of your character.
And the fate of a trembler? Well, it was genuinely terrifying. This wasn't just losing your right to vote. It was what historians call a social death. You were still walking around, still breathing, but your entire place in society was just erased.
The historian Xenophon gives us this absolutely brutal, detailed list of the humiliations. A coward was a total outcast. He was kicked out of meals, left off sports teams, he was shoved to the back in performances, he had to step aside for everyone else on the street and give up his seat even for guys younger than him. The shame was so deep it stained his entire family, making it almost impossible for his daughters or sisters to get married. In Sparta, a life of dishonor was seen as way, way worse than death itself.
Now, a system this brutal and this exclusionary, it's going to have some serious long-term effects. By constantly kicking citizens out for being poor or for being afraid, Sparta created a massive demographic crisis for itself. It's a phenomenon the ancient Greeks even had a word for, oliganthropia, a shortage of men.
So let's get a baseline. Around 480 BC, right about the time of that famous Battle of Thermopylae, the historian Herodotus figures there were about 8,000 full Spartan citizens. This was pretty much Sparta at its absolute peak.
But just watch what happens over the next 100 years or so. By 418 BC, the historian Thucydides already sees a big drop. And then comes the real shocker. By 371 BC, at the catastrophic Battle of Leuctra, Xenophon tells us there are only 700 Spartiates left to fight, from 8,000 down to just 700 in just over a century.
I mean, that's a demographic death spiral. And sure, wars and even an earthquake played a part, but the main cause wasn't something from the outside. It was Sparta's own social system, which was relentlessly shrinking the very citizen body it was supposed to be protecting.
So what was really driving this collapse? Well, Aristotle gives us the answer again. As time went on, land and wealth just got more and more concentrated in the hands of a few super-rich families. That meant more and more Spartans fell into poverty, couldn't pay their mess dues, and boom, they were stripped of their citizenship, becoming those inferiors. The very system designed to create equals was actually creating savage inequalities that were destined to destroy the state.
And that brings us to our last big piece of the puzzle. If the reality was this brutal cycle of exclusion and decline, why on earth do we have this enduring image of Spartan equality? The answer lies in what historians call the Spartan mirage, this idealized vision of Sparta that was incredibly popular even back in the ancient world.
You know, to really understand history, you have to understand your sources. Who's telling the story? A lot of what we know comes from huge admirers like Xenophon, who just loved Spartan discipline. Others, like the Athenian nobleman Critias, praised Sparta for their own political reasons. It was really the sharp-eyed critic, Aristotle, who gave us the clearest view of all the problems. When you see these different biases, you can start to see how that idealized mirage got built in the first place.
So, at the end of the day, this is the paradox. Sparta was totally defined by this constant, powerful tension between its own amazing ideal of a community of equals and the harsh, unequal reality of a system that demanded a price that many of its own citizens just couldn't pay.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question. The story of Sparta is this powerful reminder to always, always look beneath the surface of the histories we're told. It really makes you wonder how much of what we think we know about the past isn't cold, hard fact, but an idealized mirage built for reasons we can only just begin to understand.